This conference will now be recorded.
Thank you very much for being with us this afternoon to everybody, and welcome to this seminar hosted by the Retrace and Proceeds projects. Retrace is an EU-funded Horizon 2020 Innovative Training Network project, which is funding the doctoral studies of 15 PhD candidates across several European institutions, while Proceeds, which stands for Promoting the Circular Economy in the Food Supply Chain, is a staffy change project that is essentially supporting the secondment of academic staff in non-academic organizations and vice versa for the diffusion of circular economy practices in the food supply chain. Thank you once again for being with us. And today it is our privilege to have with us Dr. Kersty Hobson. Kersty is a reader in human geography and director of undergraduate studies at the School of Geography and Planning at Cardiff University. She has also held academic positions at the University of Birmingham, at Australian National University, and at the University of Oxford. And her current research focuses on issues of social and environmental transformation, particularly in the fields of sustainable production, consumption, and multi-level environmental governance. Recently, Kersty has been focusing quite a lot on the socio-political implications of and the challenges for the circular economy agenda. We know that a lot of the circular economy research appearing in different fields, it's characterized by a very technocratic approach. Kirsty brings to this debate a very critical lens, a very critical approach, which we share, and a lot of the recent research from Kirsty has inspired our ESRs working on the Retrace project. So that's why we thought to invite her for this seminar, and I'm sure that after her presentation there will be a very nice and stimulating debate. So I won't be taking any more of your precious time, so over to you, Kirsty, and you can share the screen. Hopefully it will work, and looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that kind introduction. I will now attempt to share my screen. Ooh, there we go. That looks like it works. Share. Can you see that?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm not sure if that's the proper title that you were given, but it doesn't really matter what the title is. I think the topic is the same anyway. Oh, now it won't let me go through my slides. There we go. All right. Sorry, I've never used this platform before, and I'm finding it a bit confounding. Why is that there? Anyway, it seems there's a lot going on my screen. All right. Hello. Good afternoon. Thanks very much for inviting me. I know you all know a lot about the circular economy, thankfully, so I haven't put this up here to start talking about the concept of the circularity and circular economy, because I know you know that. But what I thought I'd do is just sort of take you on a bit of a journey with me in terms of how I got to looking at the circular economy and some of the things that occurred to me along the way, and how I ended up writing what I've been writing. because of that. I didn't really sort of set out thinking, okay, let's have a look at the circular economy, but it went that way. So basically my background is in social and biological anthropology and also human geography. So I'm very much a social scientist by training, but I also did some primatology, and that's probably one of the loves of my life, really. But anyway, that's another story. But about a decade ago, I was working on a EPSRC funded project with colleagues in the UK as part of their resource efficiency stream. And this was looking at electronic waste. As the EPSRC remit suggests, it was very much about the engineering and the science aspects of that, so working with green chemists and designers. And I was I think it's fair to say, token social scientist on the project, which is, anyone who's ever been in that position knows it's a bit of a mixed blessing, that no one really understands what you do, but because they don't understand what you do, they let you just do what you want, really. So that was kind of fun. So as part of that, at that point in time, the circular economy, so we're going back a decade now, didn't have the sort of gravitas and the focus that it did, that it does at the moment. It was starting to emerge quite strongly, but certainly wasn't on the radar in terms of, you know, the European Commission. So at that point in time, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation was certainly central in promoting. So I just thought, okay, what is this thing, the circular economy? So I got out the reports and had a look at, you know, this butterfly diagram, which obviously you've all seen 101 times from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And I thought, oh, look at that. That's really interesting, because as all roads used to lead to Rome, all loops in the circular economy lead to the user consumer. And so that kind of made me think of somebody who spent the last 20 years thinking about sustainable behaviour change and citizens' role in environmental problems, that actually we might be seeing an interesting shift in terms of how the role of the citizen consumer in these issues. But as you know where I'm going with this, I'm setting this up as a bit of a straw man, of course, because that necessarily wasn't the case at that point in time. So when I started looking at a bit more about what was actually being said beyond this particular diagram, it seemed to be a lot less clear, or a lot less upfront about the user and the consumer. So the roles that we were being given at that point in time, and I'm talking about sort of various quite low-level policy documents at the time, but the European Commission documents started to emerge after those years. And it was certainly the roles that were being put forward for us as citizens and consumers and users, was that of acceptance and buy-in to the new business models that were hopefully coming out of more circularity. And the question about, well, why would consumers and users bother getting involved in circularity, and certainly what I was reading about 10 years ago, was basically framed very much, well, actually, I say 10 years ago, but it's still predominantly like this, very much as a win-win approach to the consumer, that actually the various ways in which circularity will come into our everyday lives will deliver greater convenience for us all. So it's a very positive spin. And of course, there's reasons for that, because if you are the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and you're wanting to promote the idea of circularity, you're not going to start by being negative. So it's not necessarily ununderstandable that that was the approach that was taken. But of course, as we know, various bits of research have come out since then to say, well, it looks good on paper, but actually the engagement gap, as one report called it, in terms of what people say they will do and what people will say they will pay for and what they're actually doing, is quite considerable. So certainly in the last decade, we haven't seen the kind of upswing of, you know, circular consumers, if you like, emerging across the European sort of continent and also across the UK. But I've gone into this in some more detail in the paper I had out in Environmental Politics last year, which some of you might have read already, and I don't want to labour it too much. But just to come back to this sort of story, I mean, at that point in time, working on this clever project, EPSRC project, I thought that can't be the case. It can't be that all roads lead to the user consumer, all loops lead to the user consumer, and yet actually our only role is just kind of accept or not accept, or to buy in. It seems a very passive, seems a very minimalized role. So I started to think about it a bit more and say, well, what actually are we talking about when we talk about the consumer and the user in the circular economy? So again, looking at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, this is their acrostic, which is from one of their reports, talking us through exactly what components of the circular economy look like. So this is their resolve framework. And so I just added in the bits on the right because I was trying to think through, well, what does it matter to us? Like, do each of these little categories actually have any relevance or resonance with us? And it turns out actually quite a few of them do. So I've just added in my thoughts. I'm not saying it's comprehensive or complete, but that was just certainly my thoughts around, well, with the Regenerate, we can certainly get involved in that with our energy suppliers. We can alter food practices. We can contribute to conservation. Sharing, the sharing economy, as you know, has been a massive one. So we can participate, buy, maintain more durable goods. So there's a lot we can do there. And that's probably where we've seen the lion's share of everyday, consumer citizen involvement with new business models, but also with the looping aspect down there, remanufacturing products and components. Yes, a lot of that is business to business, but certainly the remanufacturing market for various, particularly electronic goods, has grown in this country in that time. So we're implicated in that as well. Of course, virtualizing real stream films and music, etc. Now Blockbuster doesn't exist anymore. And exchange, that looks like it's just the big companies, but actually it's about us exchanging our current practices of consumption for choosing more sustainable product service systems. So it turns out that actually it's a lot more than just accepting and buying in to the circular economy that's being asked of us all. Hold on, there we go. And I just want to make a philosophical, theoretical point, but one that's really, really important to how I see this. I don't know if you've ever come across the work of Timothy Mitchell. He's a political scientist. He basically works on the politics of the Middle East, based in the USA. And he wrote a book a few years ago, called Carbon Democracy. And I think we've all read a lot in our lives, but actually this is one of the books that has never left me in terms of it really shifted my perspective on things. It's a very dense, historically dense book, so not an easy read. But what he's saying, he's making the point, and he's basically talking about how political systems and energy systems are inextricably linked. We don't create society and then go, ooh, what kind of energy provisions do we want now? We've created society. We're saying there is a co-evolution, particularly around the switch from coal to gas in recent years, that has changed the fundamental sort of setup of society. I know that sounds quite profound, and actually it's a very convincing thesis if you read the book. And he makes the point that in introducing technical innovations or using energy in novel ways or developing alternative sources of power, we're not subjecting society to some new external influence, or conversely using social forces to alter an external reality called nature. We are reorganizing socio-technical worlds in which what we call social, natural, and technical processes are present at every point. It's quite a lot in that, but if what he's basically saying is, as I've said already, the socio and the technical are so inextricably linked. They are constantly remaking each other that we can't separate them out. And I think that really resonates. Well, he talks about energy, but also technical innovations. And as we said at the opening, a lot of the circular economy has been very techno-focused. And so that assumption that we can hold society and politics constant while we change technology, Timothy Mitchell is certainly saying that's never been the case and that never will be the case. So basically the circular economy from this perspective isn't about changing changing sort of particular products or changing particular systems per se. It's about remaking particular worlds. So that then obviously makes it into such a huge project that you almost want to stop and say, well, how could we possibly do that? But from my perspective as a social scientist, I think that makes it even more interesting, because it's about, well, what worlds are we remaking from the types of circular economy that are becoming apparent? And I am a critical social scientist, but fundamentally I'm an optimistic, constructive social scientist. So in that remaking, I think in looking for the ways that we may be not be doing it so well, I hope to find ways that we can do it better. I just wanted to say that I'm not just I think I'm sort of preempting myself, because I know, you know, what's about to come isn't necessarily a positive take on the circular economy, but I hope where it gets us is to the potential for more positive action. So I've been asking myself, this is what I've been doing since then, really, when I actually get some time for research, is actually asking, what kind of world then is the circular economy making or remaking? And I think I'm quite comfortable to say that so far not really so good. The circular economy is argued, again, by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation as being a framework for an economy that's restorative and regenerative by design. And that's great. What sort of economy is it recreating as well? I think it's fair to say from my reading and the majority of the action that's ensued is that it is one of continued economic growth and accumulation. Now, we can get into debates about degrowth and how that connects to circularity afterwards, and that's something that's certainly very interesting and perhaps an area that needs more thought. Well, it is an area that needs more thought, but certainly we've seen people who are sort of advocates of circularity from a business perspective, as you might expect, of course, were arguing that actually this is an opportunity to make a bit more money, to create new customer segments, and for a market expansion. And there's one report there by McKinsey who basically talked about the key is not to cannibalize existing markets. So this is a sense of actually an expansion of the kind of economy that we have. And I know that there are counterpoints to that in terms of a lot of work going on at the more grassroots level that is pulling back from that. So it's not a one-way street in that sense. One of the things that has been becoming more apparent from various other people's work, more so than mine, I mean, certainly there's a Zink and Geyer paper that came out in 2017 about rebound effects in the circular economy. That's another one that's stayed with me and has certainly formed my thinking. And also this idea of displacement has been under-acknowledged. And I've got rent the runway there just because the displacement example, this is one I kind of give my students, you know, to try and help it land with them, is that I remember being at a workshop thing a few years ago, and there was somebody there talking about them running a clothes rental business, and they were saying, you know, how fantastic it was, people could now borrow a ball gown, wear it for one evening and then return it legitimately, etc. And they were basically saying, oh, this is such a great innovation for the circular economy. And I asked, well, how much of that is actually displaced consumption, i.e., do you know that those people chose to rent instead of buy, or are they renting just because they can now and they're carrying on buying the normal clothes that they would buy anyway? Stunned silence in the room. And I was like, well, you can't argue that it's got a positive environment. Yes, it might be more circular, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're having a positive environmental impact. Can you separate those two things out? And the more I see of this kind of model, the more I realize that actually we've confounded those two things very, very easily. And they slip into each other quite easily, the environmental impact and the circularity. But we should never assume that they are actually mutually inclusive. And even people who should know better sometimes get those two mixed up. So asking those difficult questions when a room goes very quiet, when you ask what I thought was a very simple question in a workshop, is something that we all need to do. This is somebody else's words. Someone said that we have created a form of nightmarish form of neoliberal capitalism, but via the sharing economy. That's obviously a very dire prognosis. But if you think about particularly Airbnb, I mean, we can talk about, is Airbnb actually sharing? Not really. Or maybe if you are in someone's house and you're using a spare room, but if you're renting a whole house out from somebody and it's their second home, that's not a model of sharing. But if you again go back to a lot of the talk of the circular economy, Airbnb and Uber are held up as kind of the poster boys, and that's problematic in and of itself, because it's more about them being framed as part of the sharing and caring culture, when that's not necessarily the case. And more recently, I've been thinking about some colleagues in Manchester and Essex University. We had a paper out in the Journal of Cleaner Production about consumption work. And this isn't labour, this isn't jobs. This is talking about all the things that you and I do in our lives that is a form of labour to consume. So whether that be going to IKEA and building the furniture yourself when you get home, we're willing to accept that form of work to be able to buy cheaper flat pack furniture, etc. Now in the UK, I don't know what it's like in other countries, but we do a lot of scanning of our own goods in supermarkets now. So anyway, you get the idea. So Katie Wheeler and Mariam Glucksmann wrote a lot about that in terms of recycling, the kinds of consumption work that has come with recycling. And there's a very strong gender element to that as well. We know that women tend to do more of the unpaid labour in the home, and that's certainly looking to be the case with new sort of circular economy practices as well, although we don't know for sure, so we have to find out. But the question is, where does this consumption work fit within the advocacy of new forms of circular practice? So going back to that butterfly diagram, the repairing, the recycling, the reusing, they all suggest new or reconfigured forms of consumption work. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that's bad or good. It's not a judgment call. It's just a genuine empirical question about, if we think of the circular economy as remaking worlds, then it's going to remake our world as individuals going about our days if we are actually taking on some of these practices from that resolve acrostic. And part of that are the forms of labour and skills that this will involve. And that doesn't always get a lot of attention if you look at various documents, etc. So I'd say starting to round up the ideas around this. They've certainly got a model in the circular economy of that user or consumer is still very much treated as a household level decision-making entity, rather than us all being parts of quite complex systems of provision that have diffuse agency and efficacy. Coming back to Timothy Mitchell's work and that idea of socio-technical worlds is also the idea about diffuse agency and efficacy, which basically means, we do not have autonomy over a lot of the context that we are sat within. So in terms of technological changes, it doesn't just change a little kind of gadgety sort of thing that you might do every day. It changes how we view the world. It changes what we can do, how we can go about various things, and in turn, it remakes us. I was talking to my undergraduate students on Tuesday about this, and we were talking about mobile phones, and I was saying, I hear you often calling your phone a tool, but actually, have you ever thought that it's actually helped shape you as a person? That actually the way your brain is wired, the way you see the world, your expectations, your attention span, all of that has actually been formed by being a phone user. And they were quite challenged by that thought. They tended to think that, again, that we are this sort of autonomous subject, and this thing that we're holding is a tool. So that kind of socio-technical view isn't just about systems of provision, it's actually about what it does to us as individuals as well. Okay. All right, so just sort of one last concrete example. so we've got plenty of time for discussion. I came across this report that came out, it was a couple of years ago now, but it's still useful, called a system change compass. Because of course, it's all very well and good to talk about, democracy and abstract ideas and subjectivities and socio-technical systems. The question is, okay, great, what are we actually going to do? How can we actually start to make system level changes instead? Of course, we go to defaulting and making technology more efficient because that's something that's tangible and concrete that we can do. Actually, when it comes to changing systems, it can be quite overwhelming. So I saw this report and thought, oh, okay, this is certainly at least starting from an interesting perspective. So the report is centered on this system, I don't know if any of you have seen it, system change compass, which describes transformations required to change the drivers of our socio-economic systems, as it puts it. So it breaks it down into these 10 different segments of a pie, and basically saying that what it's trying to do is take the idea of transformation and actually say, well, what does this mean in policy terms, which is a very, very useful kind of intervention. And when we think about the circular economy, all 10 pieces of that pie actually would apply. But for the sake of brevity right here, what I was looking at was the redefining consumption component of it. So when I looked at that, the redefining consumption, again, coming back to that user-consumer perspective, says that what we really need to do is to shift from owning products as part of individual identity to experiencing and using products and services as part of individual shared and collective identity. That's a very interesting assertion, and I'm definitely not saying that it's wrong at all. I think that they're onto something here. I think that's right. But the question is, again, beyond those broad sort of statements, how do we actually start to do concrete interventions to do that? So in this report, it has a number of suggestions about how we do that. One of them suggests we educate consumers and provide them with information such as product passports to empower them to make informed choices. But unfortunately, research has shown, especially the last sort of 20 years or so, including my own research, that actually this kind of notion of education and empowerment for consumers is really problematic, because it's not about, yes, information and everything is important, it's also about saliency, and we forget that, by which I mean that endless research has shown that you can give people all the information you want, but if at the point of purchase the issue that's represented isn't salient, isn't in their mind, isn't at the front of their mind, the information will just slough off them. So you could put all the stars and all the carbon footprints you want. If someone isn't thinking about that as they're purchasing, it won't make a difference. So the question really isn't just about information, it's about how do you make this issue salient as people go about consuming. That isn't always addressed that well. Another one, it says, is explore the opportunities offered by a less ownership biased younger generation and provide consumers with alternative options to meet their needs. I find that point really interesting because I'm actually just in the process, hopefully, of starting a project here in Cardiff with our Library of Things and the Repair Cafe Wales and another colleague, actually looking at university students' views on repairing and reusing and sharing, because I think that idea that younger people are sort of by default less ownership biased is a bit of a myth. I think it's a lot about what people can afford, and once that affordability issue doesn't become an issue as people start to earn money, I don't think we will see the groundswell of sharing that we expect. I've certainly got some bit of evidence to support that, but I'd like to get more. Again, that's not just to be negative, but I think what we're doing is we're assuming stuff and just saying, oh, that younger generation, they'll be fine, we don't have to worry about them. I don't think that's the case. So I think for that point, I think the jury is out more than anything. And another point this report says is support transition of governance, legal and financial systems to enable product ownership business models. That's great, but I wonder if is that all we're really asking of governance, legal and financial systems when it comes to the consumer user. I think we can go further in terms of how we can rally the systems that we have to actually do more than just think about business models. So I'm just going to round up by what I mean by that now. It really strikes me, and I think this is the nub of it, is that for a long time, when you look at circular economy events, etc., you hear people talking about disruption. It seems to be like one of those words that people like to roll off the tongue. And that's fine, but really the theory of change at the heart of the circular economy when it comes to consumers and society has not been disrupted. We are very much still left with that kind of rational or bounded rationality economic actor who passively accepts in what the market has to offer, and that's kind of the ambit of their role. But on the other hand, they'll do their bit for their community by sharing and caring, and that's such a problematic. I mean, of course I'm parodying here, but it's not an completely inaccurate parody when it comes to what I've been reading. So if we're going to disrupt innovation, that innovation has to be around the theory of change as much at the heart of the circular economy. So if we are to shift towards experiencing and using products and services as part of individual shared and collective identity, as this report suggests, you know, what do we do? How do we get there if what this report is suggesting isn't enough? It certainly has to go beyond renting or borrowing. We can't assume that the sharing economy brings with it all the social impacts that have been assumed along the way. For example, you know, one of the biggest markets around car sharing, research here shows that actually doesn't create a sense of connection or an obligation to other users. In fact, it can often make users a little bit anxious and annoyed that the person who borrowed it before them actually have left it in a mess. So those kinds of, the assumption is that if you change the business model or you change the model of sharing, then all the good social impacts will ensue afterwards. That's certainly not the case. You have to have those social impacts front and centre. So what would reshaping our collective socio-material relations require? How do we remake the kind of socio-technical worlds that we would hope for? Well, one, we have to think obviously about systems rather than individuals. So if we're thinking in terms of systems of provision, you know, where and how are these new forms of sharing made available spatially and socio-economically speaking? And I'm saying that because through this project I'm hoping to do with my own university, just even thinking about how and where within a city like Cardiff that has its own, you know, planning, that has its own economic imperatives, that has a city council and, you know, an economic plan that is very much still about growth. How do you find those spaces and that funding to actually do this kind of work, which is not necessarily about growth? How do you actually make those available in particular places and also to a wider range of people than we're currently seeing engaging with things like repair cafes? Because it is, I mean, I don't know what it's like in other places, but certainly in the UK, it's still very much white middle class engagement that you're getting. And how and who are the skills needed for consumption work attained and maintained? And, you know, that's a really good question. Who knows how to repair stuff? Where is this actually going to come from? If that is the smallest loop, if you go back to the butterfly diagram, the smaller the loop, hopefully the less of the environmental impact. And the smallest loop is repair. How do we know how to repair things? I mean, thank God for YouTube. I've learned how to repair a few things from YouTube, but still, if you're not confident, then you wouldn't do that. And final point, what about the role of public funding? You know, we focus so much on businesses, and of course there's a good reason for that, but I've been looking at the sort of models of public funding we have here in Wales, and in Wales we have some great policies and we've got some really good work going, and I think the Welsh Government are fab, so it's not a criticism of Wales at all, but their model of funding things like libraries of things and repair cafes is very much the traditional, we'll give you a few years of seed funding and then you're on your own. But if actually we're expecting things like repair cafes to actually usher in a lot of these kind of socio-political and technical changes, that doesn't seem to me an adequate support being offered to this whole project. So again, that kind of theory of change of public funding is problematic. There's a lot of things, a lot more research to be done, a lot we could do better. But again, I don't want to suggest, I think it's too easy just to kind of, and I've certainly been at conferences and, you know, had comments from colleagues who were very critical, just sort of roll their eyes at the circular economy and call it greenwashing and all of that. And I think, okay, they're not wrong on many fronts, but it's also a bit of a lazy way of viewing things. I'm very optimistic and hopeful, and I think it's opened up spaces and conversations that we weren't having 10, 15, 20 years ago. And all of your work as well, no doubt, is pretty innovative. So I'm very much in support, and I think the role of sort of the critical social sciences is to illuminate stuff that we're missing and to hopefully then constructively help to think through ways of doing it better, rather than just ending at critique and then, you know, dropping the mic and walking out, because I think we have a bigger role to play as researchers in social change than perhaps we have previously. So that's kind of how I'm seeing all of this. So to give us time, yeah, thanks for listening. There's some of the references that I've used that I find, so there's one there from ecological economics, or a couple from ecological economics actually. As you can see, I may be in the School of Human Geography, but I don't necessarily read a lot of human geography, so quite interdisciplinary. Anyway, I'll stop sharing my screen now. Thanks very much for listening to me go on for quite a while, and yeah, look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Kersty, for this fascinating talk and for the wave of optimism you were able to infuse. And I'm sure there are many questions from the audience. If you want to ask questions, I would say you can write your name in the chat, and we can go in order and you know, follow the order that we can find in the chat. Is there anybody who would like to start with a question for Kersty? At this point, you can just go, just open your mic and speak. Otherwise, I have a question. I can start with the questions, and then we can go to the audience. So yeah, Kersty, I really liked, you know, your talk, mainly because of the very optimistic, you know, message you wanted to give. I really share, you know, this view in the sense that I acknowledge I've been writing quite a lot of critical pieces about the circular economy, but one thing that I always acknowledge is that at least in certain parts of the world, the circular economy has started, you know, some positive processes. It has created awareness. And I think, you know, this depends on the fact that it deals with some of the most visible byproducts of capitalist societies, of industrial societies, that is waste. We have had waste crises even in the global north, even in the middle of Europe. So I think, you know, we don't need, as you said, to drop the CEE flag, even if sometimes the sort of outcomes we see are quite disappointing. You know, we might be tempted to say, okay, is this just an alternative wording for green growth, as you were saying, mentioning the report from McKinsey. So clearly, there is this risk, but we don't have to, throw away the baby with the bathwater and essentially, forget what circular economy as a concept has allowed us to achieve in terms of awareness. My question is mainly looking, at this idea of alternative competing circular economy futures that could arise. I don't know if you read a recent paper of Thomas Bowens, which classifies, the potential circular futures across two axes, a 2x2 matrix. And certainly, he identifies this sort of neoliberal, growth-oriented circular economy as one of the possible scenarios. According to you, what would be a desirable circular future, and what should be, the sort of relevant characteristics that a desirable circular future should have?
Woo, that's the question. I did read Thomas's paper, yeah, and it's a while ago now, so I can't recall it completely. But I mean, honestly, I have a little bit of a problem with that kind of methodology of futures, because what you end up with is like a one-trick pony future. And we know that reality now is made up of all those different things, isn't it? It's very neoliberal, but there's also lots of interesting grassroots stuff going on, etc., etc. So when I look at that, I think, well, it's going to be a mixture of all of that, isn't it, really? I suppose the question is about predominance of those different models. And I think certainly in terms of, well, just to come back to your point about being optimistic about circularity, I mean, one of the things that I've observed here in Wales is that, well, we've got the third highest recycling rate, domestic recycling rate in the world, which the government goes on a lot about, but they've realised that actually that's not enough. So their approach now is called Beyond Recycling, and it is a circular economy platform. And in doing that, what they've done is gone, actually, who's doing some really good stuff already in Wales? Let's bring them in. And now you've got these various institutions, that they could be small companies, lots of really interesting small companies, but also charities, who are being brought in to quite high level conversations because they're already doing it. And sounds like I'm not answering your question, but I guess I'm thinking about what the potential ramifications of that are going forward. That if those people are taken very seriously at a policy level, the questions I was saying before about, well, where are repair cafes? Does everyone have access? Do we know how to repair stuff? Are kids being taught about repair in school? All those kinds of really fundamental things, they start to get onto the political agenda. So I'm not somebody who's saying, let's smash capitalism, because I think that would cause a lot more misery than some people think. But certainly I would like to see those kinds of public spending and support, and it being a full social agenda. I think we can have a future where actually that gets emphasised over these kind of product service system individuation, which really, for most part, most consumers don't.
Well, I think there is a connection problem, Kirsty. We cannot hear you anymore. Yeah, I think the connection has frozen. Okay, well, in the meanwhile, we can collect other questions. I see there is a question from Giuseppe. Probably we can ask this to Kirsty when she's back.
Sorry. I mean,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No,
well,
you're back.
yeah, it just
I think
completely my neck.
when
The
the
joke.
network was down for a moment. No, yeah, thank you. I think we got the answer
Yeah,
to my
yeah,
question.
okay.
That was clear. I think there is a question from Giuseppe in the chat. Giuseppe, would you like to ask the question yourself?
Yeah, thank you very much, Andrea, and thank you very much for the presentation, Kersty. My question is also in the chat. So what is the added value or the difference that human geography can contribute to the academic debate of the circular economy? So when we think on the circular economy and its territorial implications, this is not a debate that, it's a debate that there's a lot of potential of development. So what do you think are the main contributions to be done yet?
Well, I mean, geography is a very broad church of sub-disciplines, really. So people tend to be like economic geographers, social geographers, cultural geographers. I mean, I'm a socio-environmental geographer, but across that spectrum, I think every one of those sub-disciplines would have something interesting to say about how the circular economy is playing out. And I should say that actually I'm not one who actually likes to put up barriers between disciplines. So most of what I read is sociology and politics, Journal of Cleaner Production. So I'm not someone who necessarily gets out the human geography flag and starts flapping it around, because I think there's a lot of energy wasted by all of that. It's about issues. But that said, I think the focus on justice, the focus on spatiality is really important here, in terms of, as I said before, you know, if we just look at cities, if we look at how people are accessing services, if we look at how the planning system works, we start to see where some of the main barriers are in terms of those big reconfigurations of accessing, you know, repair cafes, etc., etc. So I don't think it has a its contributions aren't exclusive within the social sciences, but certainly there's a lot to say about, well, what are the actual socioeconomic implications? So, for example, I've got a colleague in Leeds University who's looking at the potential costs of net zero policy on poorer households in the UK economy, and we can I mean, I know net zero isn't circular economy, but there's certainly a lot of crossover, and we can certainly see that actually who the losers and the winners are going to be tends to be the poorer getting poorer under some of the particularly around energy, etc. So yeah, it has a lot to add, but it's not exclusive in the social science. But I think it's the spatiality, the focus on justice, and that kind of multi-level with a kind of view of the nuances of implications of policies and interventions that it certainly has something to say.
Thank you, Kirsty. There is another question from Akis. Akis, would you like to go?
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. Just a follow-up question to what Andrea asked earlier. So, given that the current state of things in which we have found ourselves is actually the result of free market economics, do you consider planning to be an essential aspect towards transitioning to a more circular future? Thank you.
Do you mean like spatial planning or economic planning?
Economic planning, resource allocation, etc.
Well, yes, but honestly, it's not my area of expertise. So I feel a little bit, I mean, spatial planning a little bit just because I'm in the school of geography and planning, and a lot of my colleagues think about these issues. Economic planning, I don't know that I necessarily have that much to say, basically, because I'm not really fully au fait with what that constitutes. But in terms of how resources are allocated, I always tend to think of that as a kind of public spending issue, but it obviously goes beyond that. I mean, certainly one of the things that has been on my mind, and this probably isn't answering your question at all, but anyway, is about where the conversations about resource constrained futures actually are going, where are they going to come from? And you know, are we going to be facing a future of like carbon rationing or resource rationing? And we don't really want to talk about the possibility of that. And I think, you know, when it comes to that level of, we will have to start planning because the future doesn't look that great in terms of many things. And it's very hard to have an optimistic scenario of what that actually might look like. Hopefully not in my lifetime, but you never know. But I don't know how much to say about economic planning, so it's not something I know a great deal about. Sorry.
Thank you.
And thank you, Kirsty. There is a question from Tommaso. Tommaso would like to read it yourself.
Yes. Hi, Kirsty. A really interesting topic. My question is about the relationship between sharing economy and circular economy, because you presented these platforms like Airbnb and Uber as not really an example to follow for an ideal circular economy. So my question is about how can you democratize the sharing economy?
Yeah, good. It's a good question. And I think, again, just coming back to, so here in Wales, we have benthyg is the Welsh word for borrowing. So here in South Wales, we have 11 benthygs, which is basically a library of things, which is local. And the model by which they're working, I think, is quite democratic and quite nice, in the fact that it's local to individual communities. It is quite accessible. They're currently in the process of buying an electric bike to do deliveries for people who can't pick things up. Anyone can borrow stuff. It's all online. It's all open access, and they're starting to work with local communities, thinking about other forms of impacts as well. So working with like local and gardening communities about sharing seeds, etc. So that's there's no money to be made. That's the thing, is that no one's making any money out of that. That is all through bits of community funding, bits of Welsh government funding, etc. So I think, of course, the Airbnb it started off quite interestingly. You probably know the story of how it started, so I won't labour that point. That is how it started. But the problem is that once something starts to grow, it starts to become susceptible to the co-option of capitalist accumulative interests. And so it's about having that model, if there is a model like benthyg that exists, where actually you can't really necessarily make much money off it, because once you do, you start to lose the essence of the model. So it's about holding on to those particular models like benthyg is using, and diffusing the models rather than growing the actual service itself to a kind of international global conglomerate platform like Airbnb is now. So I think it is possible. It is definitely possible, but it requires a lot of on the ground work, a lot of patience, and a lot of really dedicated people. And we forget that, actually, that the people who work for benthyg are just amazingly smart, and we're so lucky that they're willing to earn peanuts for what they do, because the whole thing wouldn't function without them. And I don't think that's right. That's not just or sustainable either. I'm sat here earning probably at least twice what they earn. I don't think that's right. But so there's kind of economic disincentives for it to work. So there's some really interesting stuff that has to happen around that as well. But so yeah, I think it is possible, and I'm very optimistic, but it needs more support at all levels to be able to work. Excuse me.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. I think benthyg is a great example when it comes to a sharing economy that is true to its founding principles. Another example, for instance, it's this platform which I've posted in the chat called Airbnb, which is a sort of Airbnb which is run according to cooperative mechanisms. Another example of democratized, I would say, sharing economy platforms is provided by several riders cooperatives which are emerging in a lot of different countries. For instance, we have examples in Italy and in Spain, where essentially, riders have got access to an open platform which they can customize and get restaurants to sign up to that, and form cooperatives of food delivery which function according to just principles, where, for instance, the riders can customize certain aspects, the time between successive deliveries, the sort of money they will getting per delivery, and where there is some element of worker control brought into the algorithm. And I think this is an interesting case, also because if you think about gig economy platforms, such as, for instance, the likes of Deliveroo or Just Eat, the interesting thing is that the workers in that case own the means of production, because they own their bikes, their moped, but there is a sort of overarching force that is still shaping and controlling their work. So putting the algorithm in a sort of public or shared ownership could be a very smart move to subvert the co-opted logic of sharing economy. Yeah, there was another question from Josep. Josep, please go on.
Yeah, maybe you both, Andrea and Kersty, you can answer this one, because you are talking about these examples of a version of the circular economy that prioritizes societal well-being and tries to be fair. The question is, which are the societal forces that can push for this fair version of the circular economy? Because we know plenty of these examples, but they are not being mainstreamed. So what are the forces in society? Can we count on governments to prioritize public well-being over corporate profit to promote this specific version of the circular economy? Is it up to communities by themselves only? Who can do that?
That's a very interesting question, Giuseppe. Kersty.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the political will obviously depends where you are, from country to country and from place to place. I mean, I think certainly sitting here in Britain right now, it looks pretty grim. Political will is very, very low, and it's certainly not up to communities on their own, because that's certainly not a model of change that's sustainable. But I think when we use the word mainstreaming, I think it always makes me bristle a little bit, just because that suggests a kind of that's when things start to become more co-opted, and when you start to scale up, etc. But I think we are seeing a diffusion rather than a mainstreaming of, as I said, I mean, I keep using the example of Wales. I guess it's just on my mind, because I've just been writing this funding policy with Benthyg and funding application with Benthyg and Repair Cafe Wales. But how things have changed here in the last decade is quite, couldn't see that coming. So I think it's a lot about aligning up people with shared interests in the right spaces at the right time, and who knows when they're going to be. You can't magic them out of thin air. So I think if we sort of look to our political leaders and say they're not going to do it, and sort of feel a bit despondent, then yeah, I think you're right. But I do think that kind of those conversations about societal well-being are happening, and they're happening in diffuse spaces. And I think that's the thing that confounds us a bit, is the diffuseness of it. So, for example, people talking about alternative food networks and local food, that's a massive one. And that is something that has a lot of traction with a lot of people, whether it be older people gardening or people worried about what their kids are eating. And that more and more here, that's connecting in with issues of circularity, because that is part of the, the food system is part of circular economy as well. So yeah, I don't have a clear one-shot answer, but I think there are drivers there, and it's about actually connecting them together smartly, really, which some people are doing quite well.
Thank you, Kersty. And yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. A lot of great and smart initiatives are happening in society. The problem is connecting them, joining the dots, giving these experiences the possibility of interacting with each other and possibly also going beyond the boundaries of the single firm, of the single organization, creating networks of organizations which also trade among themselves based on a mutual understanding, based on a mutual implementation of certain principles that we have been talking about here. And yeah, of course, as Giuseppe was saying, you know, we cannot expect governments to lead the way on these, but there is a lot that we as researchers can do and are already doing, trying to connect these experiences that are being built in society and that are inspired by more just principles. Okay, unless there is any other question, I think there is no other question in the chat. I just want to thank Kersty for what I think has been a great talk and a very, very stimulating Q&A question. And Kersty, I'm sure this has been food for thought for our early stage researchers. And of course, you know, we will record this session. Session has been recorded. We will post with your consensus onto our YouTube channel in such a way, you know, that this will be accessible to the public. And of course, we will stay in touch, and we will also inform you about future initiatives that as Retrace and Proceed project we might launch. Thank you very much once again. It has been a pleasure and an honor having you with us today. And once again, see you soon.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Great questions. Good luck.